Russia's economy, at least on the surface, appears more resilient than many expected. Inflation is not spiraling out of control. The ruble, while volatile, has avoided total collapse. Official growth figures suggest the system is still functioning. From a distance, it looks like the war hasn't broken the economy the way sanctions critics once predicted. But this surface stability hides a deeper transformation that is far more consequential. Russia is now operating on a sustained war budget. Not temporarily, not as an emergency response, but as a structural feature of the economy. And while that budget has not triggered an immediate crisis, it is quietly reshaping how money flows through the system, what sectors survive, and what parts of the economy are slowly being starved of resources. This is not the story of a dramatic collapse. It is the story of pressure. And pressure, when applied long enough, changes everything. To understand why Russia's war budget is quietly breaking the economy, you first have to understand how it's being financed. Unlike a short conflict funded by reserves or a temporary spike in borrowing, this war has required continuous, large-scale spending month after month. Defense outlays have surged, security spending has expanded, and state support for key industries has grown dramatically. That money has to come from somewhere. Some of it comes from higher revenues during periods of elevated commodity prices. Some of it comes from increased taxation, both direct and indirect. Some of it comes from borrowing, both explicit and hidden. And some of it comes from inflationary mechanisms that quietly transfer purchasing power away from households and businesses. None of these tools, on their own, necessarily cause immediate damage. Governments use them all the time. The problem emerges when they are used simultaneously, at scale, and for an extended period. As war spending rises, it begins to crowd out other priorities. Infrastructure investment slows. Civilian sectors receive less support. Long-term development projects are delayed or canceled altogether. The economy does not stop functioning, but it becomes increasingly skewed towards state-directed activity tied to the war effort. That shift matters because it changes incentives. Capital flows towards sectors protected by government spending and away from areas driven by productivity and innovation. Businesses that rely on consumer demand, foreign technology, or external financing face growing constraints. Over time, the economy becomes less flexible and more dependent on continued state intervention. This is where the illusion of stability begins to diverge from reality. Official statistics may show growth, but growth driven by defense spending is not the same as growth driven by productive investment. Military output does not generate long-term returns in the same way infrastructure, education, or private sector innovation does. It absorbs resources without expanding the economy's future capacity. At the same time, maintaining macroeconomic stability under these conditions requires increasingly aggressive policy choices. Interest rates are kept high to defend the currency and contain inflation. Capital controls are adjusted to manage outflows. Banks are guided, implicitly or explicitly, to support state priorities. These measures work, but they come with costs that compound over time. High interest rates suppress borrowing and investment. Capital controls distort market behavior. Policy guidance reduces risk-taking and experimentation. None of this produces a sudden shock. Instead, it creates a slow grind that erodes dynamism. Households feel it through higher prices and reduced purchasing power. Businesses feel it through tighter credit and limited growth opportunities. Regional governments feel it through budget strain and delayed projects. The system holds, but it holds under tension. One of the most dangerous aspects of this kind of pressure is that it doesn't trigger clear warning signals. There is no single moment where everything breaks. Instead, policymakers become locked into a cycle where stepping back feels riskier than pushing forward. Once war spending reaches a certain scale, reducing it becomes politically and economically difficult. Defense industries expand. Employment becomes tied to state contracts. Regions become dependent on military-related activity. Cutting back threatens jobs, incomes, and social stability. At the same time, financing that spending becomes harder as the easy options are exhausted. Reserves decline. Borrowing increases. Inflationary pressures re-emerge. Each additional ruble spent delivers less marginal benefit and creates more downstream strain. This is how war budgets quietly break economies. Not through collapse, but through rigidity. Another critical factor is the loss of external integration. Sanctions, trade restrictions, and reduced access to global capital markets limit the economy's ability to compensate for internal inefficiencies. In a more open system, capital, technology, and competition can offset some of the distortions created by heavy state spending. In a closed or semi-closed system, those distortions accumulate. Domestic substitutes are often less efficient. Parallel supply chains are more expensive. Informal workarounds raise transaction costs. Again, none of this stops the economy from functioning. It simply makes everything more costly and less productive. Over time, the gap between what the economy could be and what it is becomes wider. This is why the war budget's impact is so hard to communicate. People expect economic damage to look dramatic. They expect empty shelves, hyperinflation, or currency collapse. When those things don't happen, the conclusion is that the economy is fine. But endurance is not strength. An economy can survive while becoming less capable. It can appear stable while losing efficiency. It can fund a war while undermining the foundations of future growth. And that trade-off becomes more severe the longer the war budget remains elevated. As more resources are pulled into defense and security, fewer remain for healthcare, education, housing, and infrastructure. Human capital suffers. Productivity growth slows. Younger workers face limited opportunities outside state-linked sectors. Innovation declines, not because people stop trying, but because the environment becomes hostile to risk. This is especially damaging over the long term. Economies are not just collections of numbers. They are systems shaped by expectations. When businesses expect continued intervention, they behave defensively. When households expect stagnation, they save rather than spend. When investors expect policy uncertainty, they stay away. Those expectations become self-reinforcing. The war budget also changes the political economy. Decision-making becomes centralized. Transparency declines. Accountability weakens. Emergency measures become normalized. This may enhance control in the short term, but it reduces adaptability in the long term. Adaptability is what allows economies to absorb shocks, adjust to new conditions, and recover from stress. When adaptability is sacrificed for control, resilience declines even as stability appears to improve. This is the paradox at the heart of Russia's current economic situation. The system is holding together precisely because it is being managed so aggressively. But that management is not free. It consumes resources, limits alternatives, and increases dependence on continued intervention. At some point, the question stops being whether the economy can sustain the war budget this year or next year. The real question becomes what kind of economy will remain after years of sustained pressure. An economy oriented around defense, spending, and control is fundamentally different from one oriented around growth and opportunity. It may function, but it functions at a lower potential. This is why comparisons to past crises often miss the point. The danger is not a repeat of the 1990s. The danger is something quieter and more persistent, long-term stagnation under permanent strain. That outcome doesn't make headlines. It doesn't trigger panic. But it shapes living standards, social mobility, and national power for decades. The war budget is not just a line item. It is a force that reshapes priorities, incentives, and expectations across the entire system. And while it has not caused a visible breakdown, it has locked the economy into a path where every year of continuation makes adjustment harder. That is the cost that rarely shows up in official figures. So when officials point to stability, they are not necessarily lying. The economy is stable in the narrow sense that it is not collapsing. But stability achieved through constant pressure is not the same as strength. Strength is the ability to grow without constant intervention. Strength is flexibility. Strength is confidence. What Russia's war budget has created instead is endurance under constraint. And endurance, while impressive in the short term, is not a foundation for long-term prosperity. That is why the real impact of the war budget is still unfolding. It is not something that will be resolved by a single policy change or a single data release. It is a structural transformation that will define the economy long after the immediate crisis fades. And that is why understanding this process matters, not just for interpreting today's headlines, but for understanding what kind of economic future is being built beneath them. If you want to follow how war spending, fiscal pressure, and economic narratives interact over time, this channel will continue to break it down calmly, clearly, and without exaggeration. Because the most important economic stories are rarely the loudest ones.